Okay, let's get started, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Christopher Hawthorne. I work in the mayor's office as the Chief Design Officer for the City of Los Angeles. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second of our 5 planned listening sessions to inform the Low-Rise Design Challenge that we are coordinating in conjunction with a number of colleagues in the mayor's office and with support from the James Irvine Foundation and our Department of Water and Power. So I want to thank all our partners in this effort. I want to thank my colleague Alejandro Gonzalez in particular, who has been instrumental in organizing these sessions. And I would like to thank Helen Learn, our facilitator this morning, who will guide us through the discussion, introduce our panelists. The conversation this morning will focus on affordable housing models and community response with panelists from LA Family Housing, Venice Community Housing, and Works facilitated by Helen, as I mentioned. And these sessions are meant to inform a design challenge that will go out to architects, landscape architects, and other experts to help us imagine new housing typologies and new paths to home ownership and affordability in the low-rise neighborhoods across Los Angeles. It's important that those new typologies, however, be grounded first and foremost in the architectural and urban history of Los Angeles, that look back to successful architectural models at precisely this scale, that respond to the landscape and climate of the region, that respond to climate change and other impacts of our accelerating climate crisis, and most significant, that really respond to community aspiration and concern, that are really grounded in the ways in which residents of these neighborhoods and communities would like to see their own communities evolve over time. So we will be having 5 listening sessions in total, organized by theme. This is the second of the 5, as I mentioned. All 5 will be recorded and added to the website for the Design Challenge, which will go live in the second half of, well, it's October, so I can say the second half of this month. And that will really be meant to inform anyone who is participating, whether they're architects, landscape architects, or other experts in housing, in really thinking about how these new ideas about residential architecture at this scale can be informed by and respond to and grounded in, as I mentioned, community aspiration about how folks would like to see their own neighborhoods evolve. So again, with thanks to all our panelists, I will hand it over to Helen Learn of LA Moss and also of our Planning Commission, who will be the facilitator for this discussion. Helen?
Thank you, Christopher, and hello, everyone. To add on to what Christopher was saying, what's exciting about today's conversation is that we have a panel of badass women who are builders of affordable housing, provider of supportive services, and based in their community. And what's great about this conversation in terms of its timeliness is that there's a lot of change that's happening in Los Angeles and a lot of change that we have to respond to in terms of how do we want to be as a city. LA has over 100 neighborhoods, and that means that each neighborhood has its own history, culture, architectural style. The city is also, half the city is zoned a single family housing. And we're also facing a constant population growth and a growing affordable housing crisis. On top of that, there is this tension, which is the core of this competition, which is the tension on density. What level of density should be allowed and where? So this conversation is going to be about also who we are building for. And when the cost of housing in LA is and across the state is unaffordable to those with minimum wage jobs, what does it mean for us to plan in a way that is equitable, especially racially equitable? In LA today, the reality is that working class communities of color can't find a place to live that doesn't require the majority of their income to be paid towards housing. And for many, home ownership is a dream that's out of reach. So with our panel today, we're going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves, but some kind of themes from our panel is that all of these badass women, their housing projects run a full range. They house the formerly homeless, short-term to long-term. The scale of their projects range from single-family homes and accessory dwelling units to small multi-unit apartments to large 50, 100-unit mixed-use projects. And their work stretches across the city, from the west side in Venice to San Fernando Valley, down to South LA and Northeast LA. So here is how the next hour is going to go. We're going to have each of our panelists do a quick 5-minute introduction of their work and their organization. And then I'll do an introduction as well as a panelist facilitator. And then we're going to spend the most of our time, about 40 minutes, on a panel discussion and make sure that there's room for Q&A for the last 15 minutes. Before we get started, I think you all know one another, but feel free to share what department, your name and your department and your role, and feel free to put questions in the chat box, and I'll make sure to take a look at them and make sure we have a robust discussion. So with that, we'll start with Becky Dennison from Venice Community Housing.
Thanks, Helen. Good morning, everyone. I endlessly find it strange to speak on Zoom, and particularly when I'm just looking at people's names. So I'll give it a shot, except for my co-panelists. Thank you. Venice Community Housing has been an affordable and supportive housing developer on the west side of Los Angeles since 1988. I spent the large majority of my work life prior in downtown LA, and particularly in Skid Row. And so when I was applying for this job and I saw we had, at the time, 15 buildings and 216 units, I was just like, how does that happen? So we have a very eclectic little housing stock over here that ranges from one single family home, a handful of 3 to 8, 9 unit buildings. And our largest buildings to date are our new construction buildings, but they're only 25, 30, and 32 units. So we have really been building in these low density neighborhoods on the west side and preserving housing. And we really tried to do both and continue to try to do both, seeing preservation and the protection of existing tenants and tenant rights as core to alleviating the housing crisis as new construction is. And we also have had a couple of shared housing sites since our inception. Those are short-term interim housing, but we do shared housing as well. So we kind of do almost everything except for emergency housing. And I think that, we've been really focused on the west side, Venice, Mar Vista, and Del Rey. We have remained focused. We've started out as a neighborhood-based organization and have remained so primarily because we started out as an organization that was trying to prevent gentrification. And if you've traveled to the west side, you can see that we didn't prevent gentrification, but we did preserve some space for as many folks as we could. And we feel obligated to continue working in these neighborhoods and not just kind of abandon high-cost neighborhoods, because we want to be able to restore the historic diversity and inclusion that I think a lot of people see Venice as, and certainly a lot of long-term residents of color and low-income folks do. So we remain focused on these neighborhoods. It has been challenging over our history. I've only been here about 5 years because the community plans and the sort of the nature of the neighborhoods are very low density. And then, cost weighs in on that. So even if you're able to capture a property, if it's too high cost and can only get a few units, that just doesn't work. And so the recent changes in state laws have been really helpful to us. So now we have 215 units in our pipeline at 4 projects. So, but they do still range from as small as 9 units to as large as 140 units. So we are still open and interested in doing the small preservation projects, though I think we'll get into later how challenging that can be. But we're trying to still continue to do both things. So thanks, I look forward to talking to all of you.
Thank you, Becky. Stephanie, would you like to go next?
Sure, good morning, everyone. Nice to see your names. So I'm with LA Family Housing. I'm our president and CEO, and LA Family Housing was formed in the early 80s. When we were formed, it was really two companies. One was, both were addressing homelessness, but with two different strategies. One was based in South LA, actually a former architect and finance officer who used to work for the city, left the city and began picking up small infill lots to build permanently affordable rental housing. The 4-unit, the 5-unit, the 7-unit, all under 10 units in size in small infill lots. And their intention was to have families experiencing homelessness, whether they were living in shelters downtown, in their cars, outdoors, be able to move immediately into apartments that they could afford long-term. I call that our legacy portfolio. So what I'm going to walk through is essentially, in my introduction, we have 6 different models of what we've been developing. So the first is our legacy portfolio, and it's part of half of our origin story as an organization. The other organization that was formed in the early 80s was also addressing homelessness amongst families, but it was based here in the San Fernando Valley. I am now, and it was the purchase of an old motel, a 40-unit. So that was the beginning of our interim housing development. Over the course of the next 30 plus years, we've continued to grow. We have 27 properties in our portfolio with 9 others in the pipeline, 3 of which are under construction right now. And we've continued to grow with multiple different approaches. So the legacy properties that were built in the early 80s, those very small units, that took advantage of opportunities of infill lots. The second generation of our buildings were more typical tax credit buildings designed in the San Fernando Valley. Really what I consider our work is, much of it is suburban development, suburban homeless services, because how people experience homelessness here is different than on Skid Row. And the San Fernando Valley, as you all know, was designed. We're working on acquiring large single-family homes and using those as interim housing models for multiple families to share in the short term as we find a permanent affordable housing solution for them. We are part of a 360-unit modular development going on across the whole city, and we'll talk more about that in the questions. And then recently we completed an 80,000 square foot mixed use development with a healthcare center, bridge housing or shelter.
We had to put up our own homes, so we decided that that didn't work, and we needed to form a nonprofit, which is what Works is today: Women Organizing Resources, Knowledge, and Services. We have developed in her story either alone or in partnership with other nonprofits or in partnership with for-profits, approximately 2,000 units across the city. We also did development in Oregon. We have divested ourselves of most of those, except there's one still up at close to the border. We attempt to go into neighborhoods by engaging and having discussions wherever we can with the locals to see what it is that they want and to hopefully mitigate a lot of, what would I say, fear about what it is that we're attempting to do, why we want to be there, helping people understand who's in the neighborhood and the need. Sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not. I'm happy. It seems like people are more civil. I've lived through people spitting on me. I've lived through people getting up in my face. This was back in the early days, wanting to like duke me out. And most of you may not know, I'm not quite 5'4", but I can be tall if I need to be. And so people like back up. So Works hopefully will continue to do what we do. We go pretty much where opportunity is. We love to partner. We also stand alone, And I think as long as I'm at the helm, we're going to attempt to do as much as we can do, because I feel like we're falling behind the need. And I wish there was a way we could collectively figure out how to impact this great, it seems like a big sinkhole, I'm not sure what it is, that keeps us from being able to get out in front of the need for housing for young people, TAYS, for elders, for families, for individuals. And I'm very concerned about the health of our city for the long haul.
Thank you, Chana. I'll end the intro by sharing also our origin story. It was wonderful to hear everyone's origin stories. LA Moss, where I'm one of the co-executive directors, is a fairly young organization. We've been around for 7 years. And we started off as an urban design nonprofit, working across the city, working on projects from public realm, placemaking, storefront remodels. And after a handful of years doing that, we realized that the impact that we wanted to create was deeper, and what that required was actually an investment in a community long term. So earlier this year, our mission was kind of refined to really center working class communities of color as our primary kind of community. And our geography is focused now in Northeast LA, and we're in that transition phase. Part of what we're known for is exploring how accessory dwelling units can become a model of affordable housing. And that came out of working with the city and the county on their pilot programs, seeing the challenge that it takes to be a developer. And while the rest of the organizations here are developers to own, operate their affordable housing projects, we're helping average homeowners become providers of affordable housing. And that's because we heard a lot of people who wanted to use their property and their assets to contribute to the affordable housing crisis. I mean, to minimize it and to also build equity. So the program that we've had the last year or so is called the Backyard Homes Project. We had over 200 homeowners in LA who said, yes, I want to develop in my backyard. I'm willing to pay for it, and I'm willing to house someone who's lower income for 5 years. And that was for us a kind of an intermediate stage of investing in an approach of development that is not reliant on tax credits. And I'm sure all the ladies here will tell you how long that takes and how it's helpful to have other approaches, which I know everyone has explored. And now we're in the phase where we're looking to expand our program to the county and provide forgivable loans as a way to allow low to moderate income homeowners to be able to participate. And we're looking to figure out how can we take this model and really invest more deeply in our backyard. Our office is based in Elysian Valley, Frogtown in Northeast LA. And my other hat of serving on the City Planning Commission means that we're gonna be responsible for all the community plans that will be updated. And then the next couple of years, it'll be downtown, Hollywood, Boyle Heights, and how we think about density, how we think about affordable housing, how do we honor kind of the history and context while still allowing for growth is something that I think all of our organizations are trying to figure out. So with that, I'm going to transition us into a panel discussion. I'm going to start off with, the point of this competition brief is to think about alternative housing typologies to kind of our existing low density approach. And so my question is, should we be challenging the norms of low density housing? And I'm going to have Becky start us off, given her history and her work in Venice.
So my answer is yes, we absolutely need to be challenging the norms of low density housing. And I think, many of us have known for a long time, but there's been a resurgence since the color of law that, low density and single family neighborhoods are steeped in a deep history of racism and exclusion. And that is true in West Side neighborhoods, with the exception of Venice, actually, to some extent, in that it was one of the only West Side neighborhoods in which African Americans could own homes. But also, beyond that, as people talked about, the level of need in this city and the number of units that we have to build don't fit in our current community plans and those kinds of things. The community plans here in Venice that are, complicated a little bit by the coastal oversight, there wasn't one ground up affordable housing development built in the last 20 years because of those restrictions. And so, there's a lot of sort of good reason and good thinking that went into some of the planning purposes as well, but we just have to challenge the notion that low density housing is the way forward for Los Angeles, or that it is, the cultural context of a neighborhood that cannot be shifted or changed. And granted, we want to do that thoughtfully and we want to do that by including community, but we have to do it. And I think Stephanie's point about modest density is really important, because in a city of this size, 30, 40, 50, 60, 75 unit buildings are not high density buildings. And when we first proposed our Rose Apartments, 35 units, which is now under construction, people literally compared it to Cabrini Green, and that level of density was really bad for neighborhoods, right? So there's this like really disconnect in Los Angeles about what fits into low density neighborhoods and how we grow from sort of low and modest density in an equitable way. And then the last thing I'll say is we should challenge density, but only, for me, only as it relates to affordability. The only reason we should be giving bonuses and incentives and what have you is if we are doing affordable housing. Density alone does not solve our housing crisis and has, major impacts on low-income folks.
Right.
Chana or Stephanie, do you guys want to talk about your approach to this? And I know, Chana, you just completed 88th in Vermont, which is a larger project in a community adjacent to low density housing.
Well, that was an interesting, how could I say, we did it on parking lots, and our partner there was a nonprofit that had been in the community since the last uprising. And one of the things that I think what we have to do, and I'll digress not just from 88th in Vermont, but which has been difficult for me. I joined a neighborhood council over here on the east side. I guess it's considered east side, Glass Hill Park Neighborhood Council, when we were building T. Bailey, because I had decided I was going to refuse to let the neighborhood council keep us out of doing what needed to be done on a major corridor. So it took me 2 years. And I remember once we finally got our permit to get through that process to be on that neighborhood council. But it's important that typically we don't get funded as nonprofits to have the kind of robust outreach that I believe is needed in the communities where it makes sense for us to site affordable housing. And so that's something I think we have to solve for at some point in time. So 88th in Vermont they had built this amazing wall that has community art on it. I'm saying it's art, so they had art on it. And one of the things we did in our meetings is let people know that we were going to do everything we could to preserve that art. And so we were able to do that. We only had a few little nicks and things that the contractors who weren't paying attention actually, caused. But it's important. We do art on our buildings, tall 3- and 4-story art that is. It invites the people who drive down the street who have more higher income, as well as the people who live in the community, to see something that's beautiful, that gives an opportunity for people to see all kinds of people reflecting themselves. And so we're doing everything we can to kind of mitigate the opposition to us doing what it is that we want to do, but we go forward even when they don't like us and they want to hurt us. So that has to be the commitment, to stand in the face of people who would hurt you if they could, and to make sure that the city family doesn't back up, that the council persons don't back up, and that the code is there to support us in doing what must need be done, because otherwise we're not gonna have all the people we need to do this, to function in this city, to make this a healthy city. Because there are certain jobs, as we all know, need people to fill those jobs. And so I think we can pay people better, but even so, they won't get the pay they need to move to the west side or to the valley. So I think we've got to take all of us and sit down and think about what's happening here again.
Shanna, what you're saying also just reinforces that it's not one entity. One organization may have to drive and be the developer of a project, but it really takes many, many players, from community members to the city family to funders, to really move these projects forward. And as you were talking about how you were honoring kind of the cultural context for 88th and Vermont and the neighborhood adjacent, Stephanie, you have many projects in the pipeline. San Fernando Valley is very diverse, and I'm curious if you can share a little bit more about how do your housing projects kind of honor, reflect, or address the architectural and cultural context of the diversity within San Fernando Valley and beyond?
So it's interesting. I actually grew up here in LA, and I grew up in the Valley. I'm an original Valley girl from the 80s.
The original.
I don't know if I'm the OG, but my office thinks I am. Anyway, and there are pockets of the Valley I never knew at all. And when I started working at LA Family Housing, one of the areas where we were doing a lot of our outreach in terms of homeless services was up in Sunland, Tujunga, and along the Tujunga Wash, and people experiencing homelessness in the wash and the hills and the parks of that area. And while our office is literally, I don't know, 4 to 6 miles from this neighborhood, it's like you're in another world. It's a total rural equestrian community in Sunland, Tujunga. It's actually beautiful, really beautiful. And I remember walking with some neighbors through the wash, to kind of see where the encampments were and stuff like that. And just, I don't know if anyone spends time thinking about this, but if I was experiencing homelessness, that would be a place I'd like to be. It was very beautiful along the wash and these white stones. And anyway, so we were doing our homeless outreach there, and then an opportunity arose to develop an apartment building there. And they have a specific plan for Sunland Tujunga community. So, the design standards are set. When we went to our first community meeting with our architect to present the design, there was, I was shocked how appreciative they were that our architect designed designed a building with their specific plan at heart, from the dry riverbeds, in front, to the landscaping plan, to all of the elements that they wanted, which I will tell you is nowhere in the streets where we're building or behind us or around us, but it is part of their specific plan, and it honors kind of the natural design that exists in Sunland, Tujunga. And that building is beautiful, and that building is completely underutilizing the site that we're on. We did not build to the density we were allowed to for a few reasons. Number one, we wanted to move forward without community opposition. I'm sure those of you on the phone know that one of the biggest barriers in increasing density in the affordable housing, particularly supportive housing space, is this cap on 50 units and below. You're allowed administrative design approval, and anything above 50 units goes to community design approval. Well, that's just a big red flag for delaying a project and potentially killing a project. So you will see affordable housing throughout Los Angeles, 50 units, 50 units, 50 units, 50 units, and it's insane. We obviously can't address our homeless problem that way. However, we don't get opposition from the neighborhoods because we work on already entitled sites. We don't ask for any design exceptions, parking exceptions, height exceptions, and we design under the density allowed because we want to keep it that 50 units. So, one is designing to what is the character of the neighborhood. We didn't necessarily design to that. The second is designing to what's the character defined by the community in the specific plan and not asking for any exceptions. That we did do. And then the third thing that we do, and this is a bit more of a recent thing that we've been doing in the last couple of years, which is really having a policy for Indigenous land acknowledgement, knowing on whose earth we are building, and really going to the leadership of the Indigenous community from that neighborhood in helping not just in the design, but in, I don't know a better term to say than blessing of what we're doing. And that's different than community approval process in a way. And it's from the design to the naming of the building to just being sure that we are taking into consideration not just whose community we're building because we feel we are part of the community, but on whose land we're building. And those all become part of our design considerations.
Stephanie, what you just said has some multiple layers of who is your community, and you touched upon it on so many different levels. And Becky, with Venice Community Housing being a community that has changed, and you serve a certain population, can you share a little bit about who your organization defines as your community?
Sure. I think fundamentally, our community is unhoused and low-income folks in Venice, Mar Vista, and Delray, though that is not the entirety of our community, with a very particular long-time focus on the Oakwood community and within Venice, and long-time communities of color. That is the community that we are most engaged in, accountable to, building community power with. It drives, sort of our design, our public advocacy positions, all of those kinds of things. But when we do community engagement, like Chana said, we need to and want to be open to the community at large, and that becomes difficult. And for a lot of folks, it is not difficult. We do have a very multiracial, multicultural, across a wide income spectrum of people who are 100% supportive of what VCH does and engage in site-by-site work and what things look like. We just started a mural project last year, and we're going to have 5 buildings with murals with local artists, sort of speaking to Chana's piece, which is like a great way for people to engage together and sort of vision and sort of have a statement in the community. But we also, are accountable to Venice, Mar Vista, Delray, and probably some newer neighborhoods coming on as well. Westchester, Inglewood is places that we're sort of looking to expand. And I think that, the way we approach it is we do spend a lot of time in community engagement. I am a community organizer by trade, but I don't have time to do that in my job, and we don't have staff to do it, but we just make the time, and we do house meetings and neighborhood meetings. And so who becomes our community is folks who are open to engaging with us. Obviously people who end up supporting us, but even, people who are just interested in trying to figure out how they can best serve their community. And, that comes with a lot of strife and a lot of, unfortunately right now, a lot of, conflict and those kinds of things, but we just have to move through those. And I'll just repeat that. And we need the city to understand that that is kind of the nature of probably where we've always been, but it seems very heated right now in certain spaces, to stand with lower income folks and unhoused folks, and understand that the community is not just the neighborhood council or single family homeowners or people that vote all the time. And so we're trying to build this broader community and have that powerful voice, but we need our city partners and all partners to recognize that as well.
I saw unanimous nods of heads when you said that the community is more than the loudest voices and more than the neighborhood council.
Right.
And what's really inspiring is that all of you have really thoughtful community engagement strategies that go beyond the loudest voices and also challenge the loudest voices. Oh, yes, Stephanie.
I wanted to add one thing. This is out of the city of LA, but LA Family Housing has been working in the Antelope Valley for the last couple of years as well. And under COVID, our community engagement strategy has looked really different. And we created, and I'm mentioning this because we're doing a deal in Lancaster, and it was the site, you know, we secured the site under COVID. So we didn't even have a chance to really even go out to the neighborhood. But philosophically, we have a rule in our company that we don't open escrow on any property until we've engaged the community. And even if we don't ever need anything from the community in terms of entitlement review or approvals or anything like that, it's because our investment is in the community, not just the people we serve, but the community at large. So that's been a philosophy of ours. We found this site. We needed to open escrow. We didn't have a chance to go out to the community because we couldn't hold a community meeting. And so it's been an interesting test these last 6 months, how to engage community that you're not always physically with. So we created a website. We did a much broader than, you know, the city requires in terms of how you reach out to people via email when you don't know them, to get their email addresses. And it's been a great process, and probably far more transparent and informative than what we typically do. And I feel like we're very transparent. But when you put your plans up on this website, and they live there now, and you put up, you know, this Q&A, and it lives on a website that people can check in all the time and check on the status of this site, I think it's a good shift for how we work in community and keeping them engaged. And they might not ever support us in certain sites and certain projects, but no one will ever say that LA Family Housing didn't keep them informed. And that's, you know, something that's real important to me. And we've been able to do it differently under COVID than any other time. I just want to share that.
Thank you, Stephanie. And actually that reminds me that, you know, the topic of this conversation is affordable housing and community response. So core to what you guys are all doing is providing housing, but in order to kind of support that, you know, all of you have some version of supportive services, programming, organizing, education, advocacy. So it'd be great to hear a little bit more about what goes on beyond the physical building and operating of these covenant spaces that are rented affordably in perpetuity. And Becky or Chana, I know you guys have a lot of evolution in this, so would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, right now for us, it's a little difficult because of the social distancing. We always build spaces for in the family housing for children to be. We have more spaces in the family housing, let's say 88th in Vermont, than we might have had than we have in a senior building. So it's been quite difficult with COVID, because what happens, we don't have 100% service folks on site. I mean, the at least in our portfolio, the developments don't throw off enough money to hire somebody 40 hours a week, every week, you know, week in and out. So what happens is, especially now, a lot of the parents send their children outside, and they're just, we built things this time so children, I had noticed in some of the housing, they need things to climb on or stand on or do something. So our focus is to create areas that families can have some relief, but there's not enough, and I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, there's not enough space inside of the housing to, when everybody is home as they are now, to make it healthy for everybody. So we have to be creative with our supportive housing family part that does, that does chatting, or, do you need something with the residents? And when you have 50 plus units, that's a little difficult. Even when you have 30 or, or smaller, to really check in. I mean, I think most all of us would say nonprofit, we're trying to get them, food, and we're attempting to deal with mental health, and we're attempting to help the children. And, we're in a place, I think in some respects, uncharted waters that, and I'm not sure how this is going to impact us going forward with family housing. Because senior housing is different from family housing, which is different from supportive housing. And so we have all of that. And then how do you best make that pencil for your organization when the needs are so, divergent? So I'm not sure if I'm actually answering what you wanted to know, but that's kind of where we are right now. And so we're always making sure that with our outside service partner, that we are sitting down, I don't mean sitting down, Zooming or talking to each other to do the best that we can with what is needed on site, where the people are and the children are.
Now, Chana, your response reminded me of how we as an organization never imagined we would get into food distribution, but we have a weekly food distribution, Northeast LA, Mercadito, and that was because we heard not that people have food insecurity, but because financially their finances are limited, it's a way to save money so that they can pay rent. And I think in these times where the impact on communities of color will be radically different and unequal, that we are going to have to respond differently. Becky, I want to hear from you, given you're at the heart of a very low-rise neighborhood, and as you develop your projects and as you engage residents, what's that balance between building for your future tenants inside your spaces and kind of being able to adapt to other kind of larger community needs in terms of open space and local retail, and having it be open to people besides the tenants in the buildings? I know you guys have taken a very interesting approach, and if you would like to share about your community land trust partnership model, it'd be great to share that as well.
Sure. I'll actually start there because it reminded me from what something Chana was saying, and potentially relevant to this group is, our smaller sites are really challenging because we don't have community space and sometimes even yard space and anything really. And then they're not large enough to have resident managers, which is a little standalone, and how do we work on that? And one thing we've been thinking about, we are engaged in a small little group of folks who are trying to add capacity to the community land trust model here in Los Angeles and have long-term in perpetuity community control of land. And those folks are really interested in preservation and existing tenants, which is great, something we've done, hard to finance. Separate from the finance piece, I think what we're trying to do is also think about clusters, right? So you still have a real neighborhood-based approach, and maybe if you're doing smaller buildings, are they clustered within a square mile, ideally maybe even closer, maybe a little further, so that you could then get to a space both financially and space-wise to have some community room or an after-school program or whatever it is that that comes out of that. So that's something we're really trying to do if we're gonna go back into the smaller sites, is really think about those things. And we have done those in our buildings over time in community rooms. We've built probably almost all of our programs in that way out of some parent or somebody's need. We've had an after school program that started in our buildings and now is in the schools. Our youth build program for young adults built that way. There's just a handful of young adults with too much time on their hands, and and so that having that space and staff and knowing people on that in-depth level is really important. We're challenged even in our new construction by doing that just because of space. We're squeezing units into like really small spaces, but through the city land program, we were able to get one very large site here in Venice, and that's what we're trying to do, Helen. It's almost like our entire 30 years of work. All the things we wanted to do are going to try to go into this site because it's 3 acres. So It's 140 units of housing. It's a mix of supportive and affordable. We're going to have a community arts center that Gregory Hines family has lent his name to, so it'll be the Gregory Hines Community Arts Center. He's was a long time Venice resident. We'll have a little bit of small scale retail. Really focused on micro enterprise and wealth building opportunities, but a little bit also on potentially small businesses that have been pushed out of Venice because of rising costs. So probably a combination of those things. And then we'll have a ton of open space because it's kind of on the canal. And that is really the ideal way of community building, of getting more impact into one site. But we don't have a lot of 3 acre sites over here, and we certainly can't afford them. So City of LA, if you have bigger sites here on the west side, keep putting them out, because that's really where you can get all of those elements in.
Becky, you just said something that's fascinating, which is that you guys have added into the uses things you've heard residents would like to see. And Stephanie or Chana, have any of your projects changed radically since you envisioned it because of what you've heard from community?
Well, not really, because having been around for a while, we know that, like we built, let's say Antique Terrace, we built space in the front so that the community, the neighborhood council, or other groups, if they asked, could actually meet there. It's on the main Eagle Rock Boulevard, it's on the main thoroughfare. I think part of it, it's like we get better at doing the same thing. I mean, as human beings, there's some things I think that we all want. Becky hit on some of it. The teenagers, if you have a household and it's 4 or 5 people and you only have a 2 or 3 bedroom, that of itself is a little cramped, and so they're going to want to get out. And so they'll go find any nook or cranny you built, your architect designed on the site, that they can kind of like make their own. And so they can be back there. If it's a non-smoking building, they'll be back there smoking. They might even be drinking or doing something. You know what I'm saying? So then we do not just community engagement work, but we have to do policing work. There's so many complicated things that have to happen when you have families that aren't related by blood, and even if they were, that doesn't always stop it. So no, I think that we need the neighborhood councils that I have engaged with, those who've, like, as I said, got up in my face, even here in LA, who the more wealthier people wanted to beat me up. And so I go ghetto, and I'm not afraid to do that. Most people don't think that one should do that because you're supposed to be professional. And at some point, it's like, you need to just, hey. So all I can tell you is that my colleagues here on this phone, myself, and I'm sure we do the best we can to house people who don't have the resources to live somewhere else. And so we're thinking about them being in the spaces that they are likely to be. Some of them, I mean, we've had some of the permanent supportive housing folks die in our spaces. And I remember this one man, as he was dying, and he was saying, he got to die in his own bed. And that was a big deal, that we got him a place that he could be before he died. And so I guess what I'm saying is, my colleagues here, we're doing what we can to house people who have so many needs, not just physical, but emotional and mental. And we're attempting to do it in an atmosphere where you not only have to deal with the neighborhood council, but you have to deal with councilmen, mostly men, not too many women, who don't get it either. And so want to be elected next time. And so they may stand against you because the neighborhood council, who might give them money, or some of the other people who are more affluent do you see what I mean? There's so many hurdles we have to go through and make peace with to house the people who need it in our city. And I think we're just falling behind because of all the rules and regulations, and we've got to figure out how to get over this stuff. So I'm not sure, again, if I've answered what you wanted, Helen, but.
It was a great response and very, very aligned. Stephanie.
So I wanted to touch on two things. One, you asked if we've changed our design in any way because of input from the community. I think, was that your part of your question? And there were a couple instances when we have. One was, it happened to be, and it's not like it's a huge project of ours, but it was also that Sunland Tahunga property. We call it the Lewis. But that wasn't necessarily something, it goes back to the earlier point when you say, who's the community you're designing for?
Mm-hmm.
Is it the loudest people, the neighborhood councils, the council office, who they tell you need to get approval from before the council office will give you approval? Or is it who's going to be living there? And I think it's all of it. It's not one or the other. So in that particular case, I talked about how we were already engaged in the community doing street outreach. And we learned something that up in the hills, they call this North Hollywood, the flats, you know, up in the hills of Tahunga, there are a lot of people experiencing homelessness in couples. It's a much more rural homelessness than an urban homelessness. So they're not large encampments. They're 2 people and a dog and 2 people and a dog. And it's much more scattered because it's all this land and they're in hillsides. And so the building that we were designing was all studio apartments. And we actually changed the design pretty late in the process to add 1 bedrooms so that people could stay together. It didn't matter whatever their legal status was. There was clearly a support system they had in each other for their mental health that staying in a couple allowed. Likewise, we've now done it, you know, in all the buildings since, but we changed our landscaping design and added a larger dog park rather than just a little dog run, because this was a property, even though in our shelters, most people have companion animals, there was something about the animals that were with the folks while they lived outdoors that was so critical. It needed to be a much more integrated part of the design of this property, with benches in it, with more shade trees. It wasn't just a place for the dog to relieve themselves. It was a place for healing and gathering for the tenants. So we did change the physical design of that building. And in 2 other properties, we recognized that there was a dearth of resources, kind of what you were saying, Becky, in terms of doing clusters. There weren't resources. Look, as real estate developers, we're also nonprofit companies, and we recognize that we are developing assets that the whole community needs, not just the tenants who live there. And so we've redesigned the entrances and egresses of our buildings so that within the building, we could open up spaces to be used by the community at large, even if it's not the tenants who live there. Whether it's the neighborhood council that needs a place to meet because the library budgets were cut and they could no longer meet in their libraries anymore, or whatever it was. I mean, obviously not under COVID, but these were design changes that we made to design components of our building that would be open to the community at large and not infringe on the safety, privacy, and security of the tenants who live there. So where the entrance doors were, where the eyes on that space would be, and how people could exit the building. So those are a couple design changes that we made to respond to both the external community and the internal community.
Thank you. Um, I want us to take us to going a little bit smaller. So Becky, you have some single family homes in your portfolio. You have an accessory dwelling unit program. Can you share a little bit more about that and what the future of that is in terms of low density affordable housing?
Sure. So the single family homes that we've had over time, and one of them has been greatly expanded into, I don't even know what you would call it now, but those we've only used for our interim housing programs and their shared housing. And not because it's necessarily ideal, but I feel like, I think we felt like if the opportunity is there and we can house folks, we should try to take it. And I think they do work well for interim housing. I think shared housing can be hard for the long term. But in these larger single family homes, that's what we've done. But we do have a project, our low density project we're working on right now in Venice the land was donated to us by a longtime Venice resident who deeply cares about sort of the Venice bungalow idea. And it's actually 3 lots. So it's 3 single family homes and then like a 4-plex of separate bungalows. And then we're going to add 2 ADUs there. And it's, I think it's a challenge for us knowing that I think you could probably build 40 units there or something like that. But it also does have some historical context in the neighborhood. We would not be able to buy that land at all and even probably do 40 units there. And I think we're trying to figure out how to combine some shared housing. So the 2 single family homes that are there are quite large. So maybe we could do some shared housing as permanent housing. We've not done that before. And then I think the coolest thing about it for us is that because it is a little more spread out and we are going to fill some of the open space with the ADUs because we want to get at least as many units as we can there. But it allows us to do some of the things we've just been talking about, right? Have a little bit of open space, even in a small infill place. And then we are doing service space in the kind of the front corner, but it'll be really flexible. So it will be available for a wide variety of needs for tenants and the community as a whole. It has been far more complex, I'll just say, to this team. It was like, oh, this will be easy little light rehab project. And it turns out that's not the case actually in our 1.5 neighborhoods. Everything's complicated in the coastal zone, everything's complicated. But it still will be a relatively fast, lower cost step forward in a property that certainly would have gone on the open market and been gone to low income people. So yeah, it's something we took on for all of those purposes that, so we believe in preservation. There is almost always a reason to go bigger and more dense, but there's opportunity in which that's not the case, and we can still capture those opportunities and be creative and do something. I think that'll be, I think it'll have a really great community feel that we don't always get to do in small spaces.
Your comment on clustering really resonates with me. Our program for our backyard homes, it's been very exciting to work with individual homeowners who have a passion for why they're participating in becoming a future Section 8 landlord. But the challenge is that all these homeowners are scattered throughout LA. So in our 2.0 version, we want to cluster and focus in Northeast LA and think about how can these homeowners become a cohort? How can the tenants support one another, and how can we have those elements that you all have in your projects of open space and community space and space for meetings and services. So that's something that I think about, especially since probably the challenge it takes to build one ADU is probably about the same time it'll take to build like 12 or 16. And in terms of just like volume, it's hard to build it one unit at a time. So hearing you guys talk about that kind of is a reminder of our kind of pivot of how do we grow from kind of individual ADUs to kind of a community clustering, going beyond just individual, Section 8, but what does it look like to have shared housing, have land trusts? Stephanie?
I wanted to speak a little bit about the smaller unit model and stuff, because as I said in my introduction, that was how we began our real estate development work. It was on these small infill lots, and literally it's a 4-unit, a 5-unit, a 7-unit. They're very small. It's entirely a bad business model. These have only one soft loan on it. It's from the old CRA, Community Redevelopment Agency, and the city of LA assumed all those loans, but they couldn't change the policies of those loans that were part of redevelopment law. And therefore the rents are capped and expenses have gone up. And these are 30-year-old buildings. And in many cases, there are people that have lived there for 20, 25 years in the same apartment, and they still qualify as low income, et cetera. But we subsidize those buildings every year. There's 6 properties in our legacy portfolio that I have to privately fundraise just to cover the cost of operating the buildings. So it's not an efficient business model. As Becky said, it's challenging. You can't have on-site managers there. It's scattered site. So, you know, we might have one manager that addresses all 6 properties. We don't have common areas or common spaces to deliver services on site there. But the biggest challenge with small site developments, whether it's our legacy portfolio or moving forward, is when a deal doesn't pencil out, there's a reason it doesn't pencil out. And the per unit costs in our industry are high. And we could explain it until we're blue in the face, why they're so high, whether it's living wage or green design elements, both are requirements of our work. Whether it's building in the supportive services space, we're required to have a staffing ratio and the physical space to deliver services. Those all go into the per unit cost. So when you have fewer units, obviously your per unit costs go up. And the biggest challenge with that, aside for being a challenging, you know, financial modeling, but the biggest challenge is just the public perception. And as an industry, we are constantly beat up for the high costs of the development. LA Family Housing Summit View Development, which is on a city-owned parcel called the Cliffs, which the city had in its portfolio, surplus property portfolio, for more than 20 years. I think I was told that there were 13 private developers that had proposed to build something on this 3.5-acre site. None of them built on it for a reason. It is an 80-foot cliff. You can only build a little bit on the top without being too explosive in expenses. But the increased costs in developing that site has never been owned by the city. So the city, you know, you have to build retaining walls when you're building on an 80-foot cliff. You have to build, you know, think of every hillside that you drive through in Los Angeles, and that construction is different construction than when you're building on the flatlands.
Absolutely.
And sadly, the city hasn't stepped up. You know, it's been highlighted in the LA Times and the San Fernando and the LA Business Journal as a disgrace in the city's affordable housing work because of the per unit costs. Well, that building, we couldn't build more than 50 units on it because the neighborhood was opposing it being built. It's like lives in the middle of nowhere. It's so strange that they opposed it, and the city wouldn't stand up for us to build it bigger. And the city didn't stand up for us when the city controller's office said, this is outrageous. It shouldn't be $750,000 a unit. Of course it shouldn't. Of course it shouldn't. But the city needs to step up and say, oh, but $250 per unit in the grading and moving dirt out, and in the retaining walls, and in all the site improvements that the city puts on us. So I think you try and get big land, but then you got to build something bigger. Otherwise, you're wasting all that land, and then it's a per unit cost. I think there is a partnership needed with owning what the challenges are of building small or building big, because there's challenges on both sides. But it's just naming them and not pretending that one is going to make things more affordable than the other. Knowing what the challenges are, and you know, sadly, the city is so big that often its right hand and left hand doesn't know what's happening. We're working on another city-owned site, and the biggest expense is the replacement parking cost because it's on a city parking lot.
Yes.
Also, the housing department is going to be upset how expensive it is. I said, well, then you go fight the battle with Department of Transportation and you guys pay for that offsite, and don't make it look like a housing cost, because it is good to invest in these surplus properties, but only if you recognize what the costs are. You take care of those costs and not put it on the housing development budget.
Becky, you're eager to chime in.
I think Chana is too, but I'll just say two quick things. Completely agree on the city land program, particularly the parking. All of that stuff is necessary long-term planning, and it is expensive on the front end, but the long-term view is such a better goal. But yes, that is not all about housing costing money. That's about replanning and reusing your city and replacing other uses and all these kinds of things. And then the other thing I just want to say quickly is the small scale preservation has been a bad business model, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. I do think that housing preservation, because the more we build, we have very weak rent control laws, we have a very hot market. So if we don't look at preservation of small buildings that we have all over LA, they will be gone and they will not be affordable. And we need different programming, different financing. It is much more of a local program. It's not a tax credit approach. And so we need help to fix that bad business model, because preservation of our existing housing is really critical.
We have about, oh yes, go ahead, Chana.
I was just going to say, it would be awesome if we could get the city family and those of us developers who've had the kind of experience that Stephanie just talked about. We've had something similar where we can talk about what is the best path forward, so that they call them FIDOs, but that's not whatever the staff is, so that the staff folks who've individually done these, they're not the ones that do everyone, that we take our collective information and sit down and work out so we can move through the process for the city and for those who are unhoused, and in the end for ourselves, so that we're not putting our entire developer fee in because we have to subsidize the extra costs that come up because things aren't lined up. I think it's really important in this somewhat timeout time that we get together with the city family and the various departments and encourage them to work together, because getting these, winning like LH5, but then DOT's in it, Park and Rec is in it, and this one doesn't do that. I mean, I know that from having done 88th in Vermont, and there's an insanity there, both for the people who are in the public agencies, but for us as developers who are willing to do the work. We'll roll up our sleeves, we'll get out there and we'll work hard to figure out what needs to be done, but we can't hurdle certain things if the city family isn't there. And you can't keep adding on higher prevailing wage costs. And now if you build more than 62 units, you have a PLA. I mean, it's affordable housing can't be everybody's bank. So how do we get the city family to work with us, alongside of us, to improve the situation for all of the people in this city that need that? You have an amazing bunch of affordable housing developers all over the city, all over the county, who are willing to do the work. So if something could come out of this today, it would be us working better together, I think, because I think we can get the resources. We just need to have the will for the departments not to make us go down to the 10th hour waiting for a document to be signed, because, anyway, there's a lot of work we can collectively do to make this process smoother for everybody, and then by extension, have more units develop.
Thank you, Chana. And I know that some people have been sending messages of questions, but if there's any final questions, please put it in the chat box. Folks who are listening, and what's great is that this is a listening session filled with people in this city family. So hopefully that there will be next steps, and this will be recorded, and with the mayor's office sponsoring it. It's exciting to be able to hear the depth of experience each of you have had and your thoughts. I think in closing, I was going to ask, what does the city family need to do? But I think in the last 10 minutes, all of you have offered a lot of options. So in my closing question, we have heard that, low density housing projects are tough for many reasons, financially, community opposition, just the cost of land. But besides those things, are there any other challenges in pursuing low density housing? Like, what needs to change? What can we change to make this a part of all of your portfolios?
I can start. It wouldn't necessarily be part of our portfolio because, one, someone else can develop it differently or better. And because we're a mission-driven organization and our work is all about working to end homelessness and poverty in people's lives, that's not necessarily who we would move into those units, in large part because we wouldn't have the space to put service offices, service space, or an on-site manager. So not having staffing on site when you're dealing with, the most vulnerable population, which is who we're focused on. However, as Becky said, the leveraging existing assets is really critical. And I mentioned that LA Family Housing has been purchasing single family homes. So we got a large grant to purchase 5 large single family homes with a goal of supporting 25 families at a time, 5 to 8 in each house, in a bridge model. So currently we have about 280 to 300 families every night that we pay nightly rates for them to stay in a motel. So at $100 a night, each family, we're paying about $3,000 a month for them to live in a little hotel room without a yard, in a terrible neighborhood, without a kitchen, etc. So we're shifting to this single family model, which I guess, to your question, it's not that we would build something of low density, but we want to leverage the existing low density assets that are there and repurpose them in a different way. So it's not one 5-person family living in a 5-bedroom house, but it could be 5 2- or 3-person families living in that same house and just using existing assets rather than building low density.
I 100% agree. We should not be thinking about how to finance and build low density models, but we do live in a low density city. And so it would be, how do we both leverage existing assets and expand them, right? So for example, using shared housing, or could there be an addition or an ADU or something that like gets us a little past the existing density? Could it be a cluster of sites that then you could maybe, build more? So I think that's the way to look at it. I think, financing a new build, we shouldn't be thinking low density in a big city.
In agreement, absolutely.
Well, we are nearing the close of our time together. Thank you all for all your insightful thoughts. We've heard so much, but there's a clear theme that low density as a purpose has to be challenged, and there are ways to address the goal of affordable housing, and think through also how affordable housing isn't everything. Like, you can't rely on your affordable housing developers to be the bank, but affordable housing developers are already doing that by building open space, community meeting space for micro businesses, and that's already being done. But in order to sustain that, there has to be support across all the actors, and there seemed to be a lot of conversation for the desire for the city family to sit at the table with affordable housing developers and figure out all the little small buckets of challenges, where each challenge on its own layers on top of one another, and it makes projects really hard to do. What I also heard was kind of this amazing history of lessons learned over the generation of your portfolios. And it keeps on kind of going back and forth of lower density, higher density, the type of supportive services that are needed. And there's so much rich knowledge embedded in that And as many of you are adapting to also provide interim housing and bridge housing, thinking about how, given that there are more resources during this time for that we're able to think creatively and to really push the rules of what is normally required. What I also heard is this kind of tone of what is community and who is your community. And it's clear from everyone that the community is not only the tenants who are in your buildings, your residents, but also the larger community that you're part of, and to acknowledge that there are going to be some community voices that are going to be in your face, and Chana will be the first one to put them in their place. Or you're going to have someone like Becky who's going to organize behind the scenes. Or you're going
I was going to say, I am actually tall, so I can truly have Chana's back.
or you're going to have the OG Valley girl, Stephanie, here, be able to talk about the depth and richness of San Fernando Valley. So community means different things, and it's important to acknowledge that that we honor residents that have been there for a while, who have potentially been displaced, who are at the risk of displacement. Just hearing Stephanie talk about honoring Indigenous people, and Becky honoring the reality of displacement in Venice, to Chana saying, I'm not going to only listen to the loudest voices. So we've heard so much, and this is just my short summary in closing, but I hope that folks on this call, and hopes people who are going to be watching the recording will follow up, take inspiration, perhaps take action. I'm going to have I see Christopher and Alejandro are still in this call, so I think one of the next steps definitely is to kind of convene the city family as part of this competition as well. So in closing, for those who are on the call, there's going to be a few more sessions. The next two are actually taking place tomorrow, the Transformative Climate Communities panel. And there's another one the day after, both for 3 to 5. And I think Alejandro will send information to everyone. It's focused on the Neighborhood Council Sustainability Alliance. This discussion has been kind of recorded on and off, but it's mostly been recorded, and it will be shared to people who are going to apply for the competition. So thank you all for your time. And I guess before I end the recording and send anyone off, Christopher or Alejandro, any final thoughts or comments? Hearing none, thank you all for your incredible wisdom, your deep passion and commitment to affordable housing and for community building, and for sharing your personal stories and your professional journeys the last hour. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Helen.